This is the Amp Hour Podcast, released April 7th, 2019. Episode 437. An interview with Chrissy Meyer. Welcome to the Amp Hour. I'm Chris Gamble of Contextual Electronics.
And I'm Chrissy Meyer, a partner at Root Ventures.
Welcome, Chrissy. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. People may remember Root Ventures. We've had Avidan on in the past. That was one of our first in-person with a person over in Australia at the same time. That was a tough technical interview in that regard, but it was a good interview to hear about Root. What is Root Ventures for people who haven't heard of it before?
So at Root Ventures, we are a hard tech venture capital firm, and we make investments at the seed stage. So that means we're making investments like really, really early into startup companies who are solving hard technical problems. And it turns out that hardware is a very hard technical problem.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah, so hardware very much fits our investment thesis. And over half of our current portfolio companies are building hardware in some form or fashion.
So, and can you define seed as well? I mean, you said very early, but I don't really know what that, I mean, like, where does that usually fall in terms of like somebody starts a company, how is it like the next day they call you, or when do you get a call?
We like to get a call before they decide to start a company. Some of our most
Chrissy's phone number is some
of our most successful companies have actually been people that we identified early and that we started talking to before they even left their big company corporate jobs. You know, people that were
really
rising stars that were really excelling in like big company settings, but had this like entrepreneurial drive and knew that they wanted to start their own thing eventually. So we really like to, bring people into the process early and have it be a brainstorming session, like not have them come to us with a formal pitch deck when they've already talked to like 3 or 4 other VCs and know exactly what their product is and how they're going to get it to market and how much they want to raise. Like, we like to talk to people who are in the early stages of, I know I want to start a company and I have a handful of ideas or spaces that I'm excited about, but I'm not necessarily 100% sure which direction I'm going to go in. So that's more of the pre-seed. And then we do that all the way up to larger, seed investments. We don't come in at Series A. So we'll write checks that are between $1 million and $1.5 million into companies that are sometimes raising $2 to $4 million rounds.
I assume that, you guys just let me slip through the cracks and that my check is in the mail at some point,
I'll send it out tomorrow.
Rising stars. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting that they do that. I mean, like, that seems like a really big bet. So how do you go about recognizing someone like that? So is it just kind of like whispers in the wind? Is it recommendations? What is actually informing those decisions, especially, they might make something big? Yeah.
Well, I mean, people say this all the time, but it really is all in the founders. Like, we're making a bet on the people, and the founders that we like to talk to, like the people that really resonate with us, are the ones who walk into our office with half disassembled prototypes that want to geek out about the algorithms that they're running on the Cortex M7. Like, it's people that are love to geek out on the technical details and that are deeply, deeply technical people, and not people that come in with like business degrees and super polished pitch decks. Because we're all engineers. Yeah, every single one of us is an engineer by education. So it's fun for us to geek out and go really deep on the technical side. And I think that that's most important at the seed stage, because at this early stage, it's a couple of people with an idea. Like, business metrics aren't really there. Like, they're not a thing. So it's hard to talk about traction if you don't have a product yet.
Well, and so then how do you decide which industry would be interesting? So someone comes in and they're they're building a drone or they're talking about a drone, but that's a big step towards that's a large step away from actually making a company that is commercially successful in the drone space, especially these days. I mean, like I'm sure there's some trend type stuff, but like how do you start to form that person and that idea into a actual company, especially with all the rigors of fundraising and making an actual product that's commercially successful?
Yeah, and I think that's actually, I mean, that leads into something that's like one of the hardest things for me is just that like we're investing in deeply technical companies, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have the coolest technology. If you have a really cool technology and you can't productize it, like you can't build a product around it, it's not something that we can invest in. And you can still build a really compelling product. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you can turn it into a successful business and have like a business model to back it up. So it's the hardest part of being a VC for me, like coming from an engineering background, is that I see a cool tech demo or I see a cool product and I just immediately get excited by it. So it's having to take a step back and say, hey, is there really a market for this?
Right.
And how big is that market? And that's the sort of thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Traditional industries like manufacturing and agriculture and construction, and how we can get automation and how we can get sensing technologies and robotics into those industries in a way that makes them much more efficient.
So let's dive back into your past. Let's talk about that. And where so you have a lot of very large names on your resume and your LinkedIn page. What was that like working in these large scale companies, and what were they?
Yeah, so I spent, I came out of undergrad. I did my undergrad at a tiny engineering school in Terre Haute, Indiana. Have you heard of Rose-Hulman?
Of course I have. That is the,
Okay.
the great. I feel like there's like a couple of schools. I put my school on it, but it's not actually in the same level, I think. So I went to Case Western. I put Rose-Hulman in
Cool.
the same thing. I put
Yep.
Harvey Mudd, where Alicia from Embedded went, and Alicia and Chris went
Yes.
from. And like there's just like some of these like engineering schools that are, and there's a ton more, of course, but they're not big schools, and it's just like you keep meeting engineers from there, though, and you're like, oh, okay, you kind of have
Yeah.
these interactions with people from there. So of course, yes, Rose-Hulman.
Yeah, I mean, there just aren't too many people out on the West Coast that are familiar with it. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
shout out to any of your listeners who are Rose-Hulman alums. It is not a big school by any means. I think it was like 1,000-ish
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
people when I was there, but like an undergraduate engineering powerhouse, just like excellent undergraduate engineering education.
I think what happens is, so I went to I got invited to a GE recruiting event, like when I was getting ready to graduate, and I didn't get the job, obviously, because I didn't go there. But but like I can tell you, GE snapped up a lot of the talent from Rose-Hulman. Like every second person I met there was from Rose-Hulman, and so I think a lot of the industrial Midwest companies are like, nope, dibs, we got them, so they don't make their way out to the Bay until later.
Yeah, automotive as well. Like automotive is a huge magnet for Rose-Hulman alums. But yeah, I mean, excellent people coming out of the school. So I came out of undergrad and made the move from rural Indiana to big city Boston, where I got to experience what it meant to like dig your car out from 3 to 4 feet of snow.
I mean, you could do that in Indiana too. I mean,
maybe
above the
3 inches
Mason-Dixon
of
line.
snow.
Yeah, I mean, come on.
Yeah, I definitely do not miss those Boston winters. But I mean, I was there. I did a stint at MIT Lincoln Lab, working on military satellite systems.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was a total lab rat. I just lived in the lab, and I was using Perl to write test scripts for hardware. Do people still use Perl?
All in one line.
Pretty much. I don't even know if people still use Perl these days.
I think Python has taken over some of the scripting capability stuff, but yeah, of course, people still use it in places, especially in like scientific. And I think, and Perl's really fast, isn't it? Like a really fast programming language.
It is. It is. When did Python become popular, though? I feel like this might have even been before Python really took off.
Oh, I think it was. Yeah, I mean, no, I'm saying like in the interim, I'm saying that Python has kind of taken over some more of the scripting and like the ease of use obviously is a little bit better, but
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure. Did I use Perl? I think I used Perl 5 like one or two times. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun for me. I mean, I got to use Perl. I wrote test scripts for these giant racks of very, very expensive hardware.
Yeah.
But I mean, eventually the pace of government work started to eat away at me. So I eventually decided to go back to grad school.
And where was that?
Yeah, so I went. So that's when I moved out. That's when I moved out to the West Coast. So I did my
Right.
master's at Stanford,
And for
and
some reason you didn't go back to Indiana or Boston or anything like that. I don't get it. What are you doing?
I would normally say it's too perfect out here, but I'm also staring out the window and it's overcast and drizzling right now.
Okay. Oh,
So
wow.
sunny California isn't quite what it was made out to be.
Yeah, but you're now up in San Francisco, right? Instead of
Yeah.
like Palo Alto or Stanford. Is that where it is? Stanford is?
Yeah. It's
Those are
in
like
Palo Alto.
they're like different geographies. So
They pretty much are. They pretty much are. But yeah, so I mean, I started at Stanford, and I started in a double E PhD program, and then promptly went through like a quarter life crisis and decided that I did not want to be in school for the rest of my life.
yep, that makes sense.
That's I dropped out at that point and went to work at Apple.
Okay, I've
And
heard
it
of
was
this Apple.
it's a little fruit company
Yeah,
based
right.
down in Cupertino. Apple was an awesome place to join coming out of grad school. I mean, it was a fun time to be there because when I started as an intern, I started as an intern when I was still at Stanford, and the first week of my internship was the same week the very first iPhone launched. And they have these like crazy parties that they call beer bashes, giant parties, free beer, famous
Hmm.
bands that they would bring in. And it was just like it was the first week of my internship.
Yeah, that's a good way to lock a student in. Be like, oh yeah, so this is the thing we do here.
I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing. And then they had one of these big like company-wide presentations, and Steve gets up there and announces that like every employee was going to be given a free iPhone. And I swear we were just like jumping up and down and screaming like
Wow.
we had just like won the
Like
lottery.
being at Oprah, like during the giveaway day kind of thing.
Yeah.
You get an iPhone and you get an iPhone.
Yeah, exactly like that. Only later did we find out that interns don't count as
Oh no.
employees.
Oh no. Well, if you sign on the dotted line though, then you can, yeah.
So we did not get our free iPhones. We were absolutely crushed. Absolutely crushed.
Well, I mean, it sounds like it worked out okay because you kept working there for 6 more years. So
Yeah. Eventually, I got my free iPhone.
Yeah.
Eventually, but yeah, I started my career at Apple as an engineering program manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I probably shouldn't admit that because to a lot of engineers, like PM is a dirty word.
Why is that?
PMs get such a bad rap. They really do. And I think that's in large part because from company to company, like when people say PM, they use it to refer to like very different roles and very different.
Yeah, I think of Gantt charts, to be honest. That's like my
Oh gosh.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I think of a program manager. They're in charge of moving things forward, getting things on schedule.
Yeah.
And they're not everyone's friend because of that, right?
I am very anti Gantt chart.
Okay, all right, taking a stand.
Don't get me started.
Yep.
I hate Gantt charts, but I feel like at Apple and also like later when I was at Square, like PMs were really technical positions. It's like me and my fellow PMs. Every single one of us had a graduate degree in engineering, and we did help drive projects from like early concept definition when we didn't know what features were going to be in it all the way through like prototyping and detailed design and mass production.
Yeah, there's a lot of details there, right? I mean, like especially probably clouded in secrecy a lot of the times, and you have to manage not just features and what the marketing people want, and what obviously there's a ton of consumer interest in these things and consumer feedback, but also then you're bleeding edge on a lot of the consumer level parts, I'm sure too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, part of my job was building schedules and budgets and giving presentations to VPs, but like that wasn't the bulk of what I was doing. Like I would also like get on the phone with a die-cast supplier for 3 hours in the
Yeah.
evenings and like scrub through like a 20-page DFM report.
Yeah.
Or it'd be like in the factory until 2 a.m. trying to debug a test station, or tour like I tour 5 factories over the course of 2 days, which was insane.
Yeah. And do all the dinners and all the stuff that the factory owners want to work with you and buy you. Was it baiju? Is that the stuff?
Yep. Yeah, I've had a little bit too much baiju in my day.
Yeah.
But the bulk of my job, and like I really feel like the part that I enjoy the most centered around manufacturing. It was like everything from picking a CM to work with, to setting up a supply chain, to like being camped out on assembly lines in Shenzhen for like months and months at a time. Like that is the world that I lived in, and that's where I really learned what it meant to develop and ship hardware products and ship hardware at massive scale.
Well, and we were talking about this a little bit before the show too. I'm not sure. I mean, like we've had a lot of guests on the show, but like at the consumer, obviously Apple level, I'm not sure anyone's been on the show that's talked about it. And I apologize if any of them have and they're listening, but have talked about like this level of, setting up large scale factories like this for a consumer level product and live to tell the tale. It just seems like really high stress, and obviously there's a lot of money behind it, and there's a lot of consumer focus. Like I said, I mean, like these are well known, well loved products. So how did you deal with all that, especially on the factory side? Like how do you even start those conversations?
Yeah, well, when you're Apple, it's easy. When you're an early stage startup, which I learned a little bit later, like it's not as easy to start those conversations. Right. It's like but just getting people to like answer your phone call or email is like pulling teeth. But I mean, at Apple, so I shipped 3 generations of iPod Touch, one Nano, and then I was part of the early days of the Apple Watch development effort. And like the thing about Apple is that they make scaling look easy, and it's really not.
Why? So
it's really.
How do they make it look easy though? Is it just because of that name recognition again, or what is it?
Well, no. I think it's more of because they've dialed in the formula for going from building like a few hundred devices up to building like tens of millions of devices per quarter. But if you think about it, like they have dialed in this formula over decades. Like it's not something that like happened overnight.
Right, the Apple one was not that smooth, right?
No, I'm sure it wasn't. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall to see that. But like, I mean, they've had so many generations of products to like really tweak and refine their formula for going from, prototype to shipping product. And they just have the power to work with any supplier they want. Yeah. Any supplier they want in the world. And they can cherry pick the best manufacturing partners in the world. Like not there's no other company out there that can say that. Mm-hmm. And I feel like as a result, they are the exception to every single rule about manufacturing. And they will always have that as their competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. And I mean, what are we talking about in terms of scale of the factories as well? Because you talked about millions of units a month. I'm surprised that you said that there's picking a factory. I always assumed it would be many factories, or maybe I'm thinking of the subcontracting piece. But like, what are the scales of the factories we're even talking about here?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It depends on the product. It depends on a lot of things. But I mean, Foxconn is walking into Foxconn is insane. It's like, as far as the eye can see, line after line after line after line, and there can be dozens and dozens of lines all cranking out the same product at the same time. And it's this crazy optimization and balancing act, trying to not only get the lines set up in a way that like perfectly optimizes not only like assembly of the product, but also like materials flow in and out, and monitoring 5S and
type
testing
stuff, and all the cells and handling and that kind of thing.
Yeah. But the scale of it is incredible. But to me, the even more impressive piece of it is if you walk out of the main contract manufacturer and go, walk into their subcons and you go a little bit further down the supply chain, the scale of those folks is like impressive to like the next level. Walking into like giant, warehouses just full of CNC after
Oh, I
CNC
see.
and just like row after row after row after row. And like they're all going all the time because they're not just cranking out, one piece for one product. They're cranking out multiple pieces across multiple product lines at the same time. So it's the scale of the supply chain is almost even more impressive to me than the scale of walking into like the Foxconns of the world.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, I've read articles and heard about it. I've actually never been to China, surprisingly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know, right? But I always hear about like whenever there's a conversation about like, oh well, repatriating manufacturing in the U.S. or not even, they don't call it that reshoring or
Yep.
yeah,
Onshoring.
That's it. Thank you. But like it's just the similar kind of supply chain type stuff just couldn't compete in that way. There aren't those factories that are ready to CNC gobs and gobs of Apple Watch bodies and things like that. So maybe could you walk us down some of these layers of manufacturing? It seems like the Foxconn layer is obviously they're doing a lot of material handling and stuff, but it seems like that's almost like the assembly and the final integration layer and testing.
Right.
But then what are some of the sub layers and how much did you have to deal with that?
Yeah, well, so quite a bit actually. I mean, I'd say the way that most folks operate these days, or most big companies that are cranking out at scale, they're doing final assembly and they're doing SMT of the PCBs in the same place.
Okay.
So the bare boards are fabbed offsite, but then they're brought on site, and then SMT and final assembly are co-located. And I try to do that whenever I possibly can, because you're always going to find board level problems on a final assembly line.
Sure,
and being able to run back and forth, I think is super critical. But I think like there's this greater trend when it comes to supply chain of people doing more and more vertical integration. So like not just will my final assembly and SMT happen at the same place, like the same company or the next building over will be injection molding all of my plastic parts.
Right.
And then one building over, they'll be assembling and testing my camera modules. And then one building over, they'll be, building my USB cables or whatever it may be. So it's like you see more and more companies going this way, and I think it's a way to be really competitive. Like DJI is like the textbook example of like vertical integration. Like when I first started traveling to China over a decade ago, like China was the place you'd go to build stuff, like set up a supply chain and build stuff, and like in stop, that's it. And now they're turning into this design and engineering powerhouse.
Oh yeah.
With like vertically integrated companies who are cranking things out at efficiencies that are really hard to match manufacturing anywhere else in the world. Like, and they've got like all different shapes and sizes of manufacturing right at their doorstep. I mean, you want a cable or a camera or a solar panel, or it doesn't matter what it is. You want a popcorn parts, you want a resistor, you want a capacitor. It's like you can get it in a moment's notice.
And so that's actually what it's going to get to as well, is this scale available to like a small or medium manufacturing operation in the first place? I mean, like, so thinking about like your startups, I mean, obviously we're going to get back to the startups eventually, but thinking about the startup world, do they have access to some of these supply chain resources that you're talking about, or is it more the higher echelon type stuff?
They do, but it doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always make sense for them.
Okay.
Like if you're an early stage startup, or if you're pushing small volumes and building in batches, you're building 1,000 or 10,000, you're not building 10 million of something. Sometimes you can, especially using relationships that you've already built, you can get access to the Foxconns of the world, or some of the tier 1, or what I like to call like tier 1.5 suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not always the best idea, because you're going to get the C team, right? Like you're not going to get the A team. You're going to get whatever excess capacity.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And then if that excess capacity goes away, like if Apple comes in with a huge order, then you're going to lose your team overnight, and you're going to lose the production run that you had scheduled for tomorrow might all of a sudden be pushed out 6 months from now because they got a big order from a big company. Yeah. So it's a dangerous game to be a small company working with big suppliers. Like that's one of the pieces of advice that I give every single one of our portfolio companies that's building hardware. It's like, think really long and hard about who you're choosing as your major suppliers and make sure that they're a good fit for the size and stage of company that you're at and the complexity of the product that you're trying to build.
So obviously we're going to go back to the large scale stuff. I mean, some of this stuff is things that the size is just unbelievable, like the Apple Watch and things like that. So what was that like working with those volumes and everything?
Yeah, it was incredible because all of a sudden people talk about like DPPM, like defective parts per million, and 1 in a million failed parts for most companies is not a big deal. It's just like, okay, yeah, 1 in a million failure, not a big deal. But like, if you're building tens of millions of products a year and you have 1 in a million batteries explode, that's a huge deal, right?
Yeah, right.
That's a huge deal. So all of a sudden, problems that most companies wouldn't even think twice about, you're tiger teaming and you're throwing a ton of resources at trying to find and identify and analyze and solve these problems that are really hard to catch, really hard to catch because they're super rare. And I mean, we would hit silicon bugs that no one had hit before just because we were dealing with volumes that they hadn't. It's like a commercial off the shelf part, but no one had hit this bug before because no one had been shipping and testing in these kinds of volumes.
Yeah, I mean that's crazy, and I mean having to deal with that is bonkers. What for people who don't know, what is Tiger Team?
Oh, Tiger Team is it's PM slang for tight knit group of individuals that like really come together and focus like all of their energy on solving some really hard problem that popped up. So
okay.
when we would have like ship stop issues, we would Tiger Team, and there would be like one person from each cross-functional team represented, and they would all meet for an hour every day and then go off to their own respective labs and be working on it all day and then summarize every night.
I mean, and how often was a line down kind of situation happening? I mean, was it like, I mean, I've read about like TPS, Toyota Production System type things where you can pull the cord and stop the whole line. But like, is that something that happened in these consumer level millions of parts a month kind of thing happening?
Yeah, I mean, when you're actually in mass production, things flow pretty smoothly. And yeah, I mean, lines go down, but the factories have a tremendous amount of like support and infrastructure in place to minimize that and to make sure that, when things do stop, they start again as quickly as possible. So when you're dealing with like super sophisticated manufacturers, mass production and scale, like once you get a line moving, things tend to keep moving pretty smoothly. Yeah. The problem is getting a line moving. Like that, the whole process of like when you're starting to ramp production and you're going from like, okay, we're going to build the first unit today, and then we're going to build 10 tomorrow, and then 100 the next day, and then 1,000 the next day. Like when you're going through that process, that is excruciatingly painful.
Yeah. Any worse stories on this side of things? I mean, that you're allowed to talk about?
Oh, I wish I could tell some of the stories from Apple ramps, but
yeah.
It's excruciatingly painful because the processes were not designed to be stop go. I still to this day swear that like glue machines are the bane of my existence.
Yeah, I did see you talking about this in your HDDG talk, which we'll link in here, and I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
Yeah.
But glue machines, huh?
I mean, I will rant. I can rant for like hours on end about how much I hate glue machines, and it's like it's inevitable that like almost every product I've ever worked on has used glue in some form or fashion, like in some place on the product. And it's like inevitably you're ready to start the line, the materials are kitted, everybody's out there, operators are in their places, like everyone's ready to go, and then the damn glue machine, the nozzle is clogged again.
It's a sticky situation. Yes.
But I swear, I think I've spent more time with lines down, sitting there waiting for glue machines to be unclogged than any other problem when it comes to manufacturing.
That's crazy.
So, the moral of the story is like, don't use glue if you can get away with it. Don't use glue.
Well, and I think some of that's kind of part and parcel of like using or doing consumer level products too. It has to look sleek. It has to have, no screw holes. It has to, not even have screws
Right.
sometimes. That seems like some of it is just based on design.
Right. And there's different choices. Like people can use screws, but they don't look good. People can use snaps, but they have a tendency to break.
Yeah.
And then my one of my favorites, ultrasonic
Mm.
welding, is pretty cool, but not all factories have that equipment in house. So it's you know glue is one of those like inevitable things that
Yeah.
almost everybody ends up using somewhere. But that doesn't change my mind. I still hate
Yeah.
it. I hate
Right.
it.
Well, and I mentioned that HDDG talk. That was all about DFM in general. So maybe you can give some of your insight into DFM, because I remember watching that talk. You said there isn't as much on the electrical side as the mechanical side, and I was a little surprised by that actually.
Well, so it's not that there's not as much. So to back up a step, like DFM is one of those things that I feel like is like potentially one of the most important phases of product
Mm-hmm.
development is going through design for manufacturing. And if you don't do that process right, and if you don't do a thorough job of DFM, like you can be setting yourself up for some huge headaches in the future because it's so much cheaper, and I'm sure you've experienced this and probably have war stories to tell too, but like it's so much cheaper to fix a part in design than it is in
Yeah,
manufacturing.
definitely.
When Yeah, when it comes to plastic parts, it's so much easier to fix it before you've cut a mold, like before you start cutting steel. Like if you're going to change your design, like do it as early as you possibly
Mm-hmm.
can. So, I feel like DFM doesn't get a lot of love. A lot of people think that it's the sort of thing that you just like throw it over the fence to your suppliers. Like you send them your cat, you send them your
Right, right.
Gerbers, and then you just like you're done. You're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, that's not how it works though.
Um,
No. What's interesting
yeah,
too is that like
I
it feels like one of those things. I mean, depends on where you are as a company, right? Like I think a lot of the startups get in trouble because they're in these processes where they're like, oh, okay, well, we're figuring out our parts, we're getting our product, we're trying to figure out if any of this will even work. And by the time that they get to the point where they need DFM, they run so smack into it because it's just they didn't think they were going to be having the volume, right? And Apple is like you said, they have
right,
the formula from decades of experience because of course they're going to sell millions of units. But some
right.
startup, it's like, oh, well, our Kickstarter took off, or we had this big investment, or we got featured somewhere. That they're all similar problems.
Right. And it's always this balancing act of like how much do I do up front because it's best practices like in case my volumes take off versus how much do I just do like fast and dirty and just get a board out or get a plastic part out. And it's there's not a cut and dry, like it's not black and white, like there's not there's
Right.
not a straight answer for it, and every engineer that's gonna do a design is gonna have a slightly different opinion on where things should land in terms of like just quick and dirty get it out versus like you could spend endless number of hours doing it the Apple way.
Right. Right.
And protecting yourself against manufacturing issues if and when your volumes become huge.
Right.
So it's a balancing act, and that's some of the most interesting discussions and arguments I've gotten into have been on the startup side when different people are coming from different backgrounds and coming from different companies and have very, very strong opinions on where they should fall on that
Mm-hmm.
spectrum.
Well, so one of the things, so first off, the Apple way, it's like, oh, okay, so first thing, I'll become the biggest company in the world, then I'll, go find a provider, right? It's like, oh, I guess I can't do that. But like it seems like too the finding of the factory. It's interesting talking to the people I know in Shenzhen, where they're like, yeah, well, I talked to the factory, and they're able to tell me what their capabilities are, and I push that back into my design process. And like so many
Yeah.
times, like having a prototype module, like you're talking about, a prototype thing that I'm making, I'm optimizing for myself, hand assembly and 3D printing and whatever I can get locally and to piece this thing together. It's almost like it's almost like a totally different design by the time that you go to a factory. And then like, not every company has the wherewithal to do that kind of thing. So it's like, it's
Yeah.
where do you really pull the trigger and say, okay, no, we're design freezing this prototype idea. And then also the new, the version 2 of this is the manufactural version of this. How do you see people dealing with that?
Yeah, you've just got to be aware that it's going to be really different, right? Like you can't expect that the version that you prototyped is going to be the same version that you go to production with, and you've got to build in time and iteration to go through not only DFM but like do a couple runs with your real suppliers, and find the issues and fix them. I feel like, I tell people all the time that like DFM is not something that you can do in a vacuum. Like it's not something that you can sit down as an engineer and just like crank through in the way that you can like, crank out a board, but it's something that has to be done with your suppliers.
Definitely.
Like if you're building a plastic part, like your DFM, you're not Googling like best practices for injection molding. Right. You're on the phone with the supplier every night and they're talking to you about, changes that they suggest that you make to your part, what they're capable of, what they're not capable of, like, what their mold flow analysis looks like. It's this like long back and forth that if you're building like really complex products, like that can be months. Like that can be months of back and forth with suppliers before you're ready to actually kick off a part.
I remember there was a really good example that like kind of snapped this into focus for me was someone at my workspace was, talking about 3D printing a part, and then they showed me this tool that we have, and it's like a piece of nichrome wire, and then you can kind of fold like sheets of plastic. And they showed me this piece of plastic that was all folded with different corners and stuff like that. And they're like, imagine 3D printing this, and then imagine folding this on this table. Like the table is obviously the way to do that. If you needed something that looked similar to this, if you went and 3D printed something like this, you're going to have a terrible time with all the undercuts and all the, like just the thin walls and all the other stuff. If you have, now think about it as a manufacturer, if you have this table available and someone comes to you and they've been 3D printing the whole time, they don't even know that there's this entire method out there. And so it almost feels like this method, you almost need to have like this like manufacturing library in your head, and you need to sync it with whatever your manufacturer actually has available. Like you said, they don't have ultrasonic welding or whatever else. So like, what did that process look like then? Like, did you often discover new techniques that they had on offer for you, or how did that work?
I mean, sometimes, and this, going back to your original question, this is why I think, and I feel like I can say this because I come from a double E background, but like, I feel like on the electrical side, DFM is a little bit more straightforward than on the mechanical side. Yeah. And that's primarily, I might get attacked for saying that, but like, that's primarily because I feel like there is more consistency from supplier to
melt some metal, stick a thing to a board. What's the problem here? It's almost like that, right?
But it's like when you come to like the mechanical parts, when you're talking about like injection molded plastic parts or die cast parts or stamped and formed or whatever it may be, like it's, the suppliers have dramatically different equipment and different technical capabilities and dramatically different like quality processes in place. So even if they technically can make a part, they might not have like the skill on the engineering side, or they might not have the quality control in place to be able to do it consistently. I feel like on the electrical side, it's like there's a little bit more kind of standardization. I feel like these days, most PCB fab houses that I use can do blind and buried vias, I mean, that wasn't the case a while ago, but like it is today. And I feel like, you can either place a 1005s or you can't. Right. It's you have SPI or you don't. Right.
It's like it's almost binary in that way. It's like yes or no.
Yeah, it's a little bit more cut and dry, and like it definitely suffers. I don't want to trivialize it. Like there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done on the electrical DFM side, but you've also got some pretty powerful CAD tools that will hopefully throw flags and PRCs if you're like, doing something that's a little too crazy.
Yeah, and I think about the DFM problems for electrical stuff. It almost feels like sourcing issues and making sure your supply chain on the components is in place. Like that's going to that's often tripped me up more than, this part is a little too close to this other part. I mean, like, yeah, that does happen and you should check all that stuff, but, and like the capabilities of a pick and place machine, but it feels like can I get this part? Is it going to go obsolete? Those kind of things have seemed to be more of a pitfall on the electrical side than other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sourcing can become a nightmare because if you're a small startup and something goes
maybe
obsolete,
Apple buys
and you have
out
to be
your entire
buy.
stock, like they just buy up the entire fab's worth. That may happen.
Yeah, no, it's happened before. That hits a little close to home, but yeah. Yeah, getting allocation of parts can be tough if you're early stage startup, if you don't have
Yeah.
a big name behind you. And there's always the spot market though. Like if I know you said you've never been to China, but at some point you need to go over to Shenzhen
Oh,
and
I've seen all the videos of the markets and stuff, but yeah, I've never walked through them.
oh, Huachong Bay to me is like it's like an electrical engineer's
Yeah,
Disneyland.
yeah,
I mean, Huachong Bay is just it's absolutely incredible. I haven't seen
yeah.
anything else
Yeah,
like
just
it.
like the stands with like all the buttons. That's really the one that gets me is like
Yeah,
there's so many buttons out there. I want to push all the buttons and try them, and you can't do that with a catalog or an online thing. So that's the one thing I wish I had:
right.
connectors and buttons and the physical piece of things.
Yeah.
I did want to ask about. So okay, we're kind of talking about how moving stuff through these different design stages and like the throwing it over the wall, like you mentioned. How does that how does that work in a big company like Apple? I mean, like and again, like I know there's only so much you could probably say about details and stuff, but generally, like they, the design team has early inquiries into like how this is going to get manufactured. I'm sure, but then how much back and forth is
Mhm.
there? Is it a one way pipe when a design comes through? So the Apple Watch comes through. Is it like, okay, design team's done with it. Now it's in manufacturing, and now we're going to DFM this thing and make it a manufacturable thing. Like how does that actually work?
Yeah, so the reality of the situation, when you're working at that scale and that complexity, like you were talking to your suppliers from day one. Like it's not a one-way thing, and it's not, um, you're not designing the product in a vacuum. Like
Okay,
you're designing your product around the latest capabilities of what, the best in the world suppliers can do. And it's tough because at that stage it's so shrouded in secrecy, so the suppliers have no clue, like no
right. You're like,
clue
I'm making a
what this
widget
part.
that has
Yeah.
electrical energy in it.
Yeah. It's really funny that the suppliers oftentimes don't know what the product line is that their part is going into until it's announced.
Wow.
So it's crazy that happens. But there's also, like, I mean, that's not the only way of doing things. Like I as I'm sure like there's a whole spectrum of ways that you can interact with a factory. Like there are the people that just email them design files, and then like weeks later or months later they get a shipment of
Yeah,
prototypes
that's
and they test
enviable in
them.
a
Like,
certain way, but the damn, that's a little scary to think about.
yeah. I mean, and then like the world that I live in, it's like you're on the phone with your factory counterparts every single night, like every night. And if you're not on the phone with them, you're like on WeChat or you're on Skype, and like every single night. And then you're out there on the ground in the factory a week before your build even starts, to make sure everything's ready. And all companies I've worked for, like big companies and small early stage startups, have operated that way. Like have been like really high touch customers, and we had teams there for every single prototype build, because that's the style of how I like to
Sure.
develop
Yeah.
products. Like I feel like you have to be high touch if you want to move really, really fast. If you want to compress a development schedule, like you don't have time for miscommunications. Like you don't have time. You can't afford the delays that happen when you find out that the factory assembled something
Right.
wrong,
Right.
or they tested something wrong because it got lost in translation. Like the presence on the assembly line can make a huge difference. And that actually that brings up like another huge pet peeve of mine, which is people who travel all the way to China and then sit in a
Right.
conference room
Exactly.
all day.
Right. Right. Why aren't you actually getting your hands dirty? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I'm in China and I'm in the conference room, it's for 30 seconds to scarf down a granola bar. Otherwise, like I'm out on the
Right.
line.
Right.
That's what I'm there
Right.
for.
Yeah, that's. I mean, and so, like I said, I haven't been to China, but I have worked on production lines in the U.S. and stuff. And damn, you will learn a lot from watching someone work or talking to them about how is that screw going in, or how is this board being assembled, what parts are getting tombstone when you're doing reflow, stuff like that. I mean, like it's just
Yep.
it's like downsampling all of your information to a report at the end of the day. It's like, yeah, that has some impacts, but you're going to catch other glimpses of things, and you're going to have other interactions that are more valuable than a report will ever be.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, yield reports, failure analysis reports, like those are great, great things, but they never, ever, ever tell the full
Right,
picture of what's
exactly.
going
It's like,
on.
yeah. Well, Bill had a cold that day, and so he kept sneezing into the enclosure. We had to, wipe him out with alcohol, and that, caused all these other problems. Yeah,
Yeah, I feel like everything interesting happens on the assembly line, and like also if nothing interesting is happening on the assembly line, like that's a problem
really?
too.
How so?
And that's if the line isn't moving, you want to know
Oh, I
about
see. I
it.
see.
Like you want to know it's not moving, and you want to know why it's not moving so that you can take steps to fix it. So if you're not out there, like why are you even over in
That's a good
China,
question.
right?
That's a good question. Well, let's move on to your next company as well. So you went to Square after that. Was that similarly like large scale? I don't really have a feeling for. So Square is the card reader for credit card stuff. Is that right?
Yeah. So Square was about 300 people when I joined, so it still felt like a startup. It still felt very like startup-ish. And we were still pretty small and scrappy, but it grew to over 1,200, 1,300 people when I
Wow.
left.
Okay.
So I mean, we were building credit card readers, and like the challenge at Square was that we wanted to build like really great looking products like Apple style cosmetics.
Yep.
But we were giving away these credit card readers for free. Like we were literally giving them away for free.
Yeah.
So cost was everything. Like it was a really great learning experience for me on how to like cost reduce the heck out of a product, and how to do everything in the most cost effective way while still having it look polished and white shiny
Yeah. Got to have
plastic
that
and
that class zero
good for
shine or
like
whatever they call that for the molds.
yeah. And it was also a fun experience for me to learn how to build hardware for businesses, and not consumers, because my whole Apple career I was very, very consumer focused, and it's a little bit of a different beast when you're building hardware for businesses instead of consumers.
Like how so?
So I mean, there's a lot of differences when you're developing, like when you're actually like developing hardware. And then there's a lot of like design decisions and trade-offs that you'd make for a consumer product that you wouldn't on the enterprise side. But like I feel like on the consumer side, like half the big battle is just like trying to figure out who the heck is going to buy your product and what they want. Like what features do they care about? What do they want? And then once you get past that, it's it's not um, it's not like you can just deliver it to the end consumer. Like you've got to figure out all your distribution channels. Like, are you going to sell via retail? Are you going to sell via
Are
Amazon, direct
you gonna give it away
online?
entirely?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that like on the enterprise side, it's like you're building hardware for businesses. The sales cycles can take a while. Like it can take a really long time to close a customer. But once you close a contract or once you get, a purchase order, um, you don't have to worry about the marketing and the distribution and the, your how you're actually like fulfilling. It's a lot more
That's good.
straightforward
Yeah.
in that
Yeah, and I
respect.
think that iteration cycle is, I mean, and just generally in hardware too, this iteration cycle has always been so hard because, uh, even if you show someone a prototype and you iterate on that and you keep it, you do 4 or 5 iterations, like, okay, great, we got this thing. But then there's another iteration cycle of the taking it to manufacturing and bringing it back. And like the friction between that stuff is so much longer as well.
Right. And I mean, there's this huge debate of like, within my PM community, we like to argue about like what the perfect spacing is between iterations. And it's like it's always a contentious topic of like how much time do you build on the front end of a schedule when you're very much in prototyping phase versus how much time do you build into the back end of a schedule where tiny little changes can be potentially catastrophic or cause like huge delays to your product schedule. So it's it's always a trade-off, and it depends on what your product is, the level of complexity, what your supply chain looks like. I know you guys have said this many times before, but like it depends. there's
Oh yeah,
there's
yeah.
no like magic schedule. There's no magic schedule, or there's no magic formula that fits every single product and every single
Right.
company.
And I think that it depends. Conversation was more about like the business side of things and when it is more known. So, and automating around that. So I think this is a good example of it depends.
Yeah.
So what was
Yep.
after Square?
So after Square, that was I got the chance to join the founding team of a startup with some of my former managers and mentors from Apple. So the startup was called Pearl Automation, and I joined in the earliest days, like before we had a team, before we had any funding or anything like that. So
True startup. So you get to experience that
yeah,
other side, huh?
true startup with all of the ups and all of the downs. I mean, Pearl shut down after 3 years, so it can be hard to talk about. Like it's easy to talk about successes, but it's a lot harder to talk about failures.
Sure.
But are you familiar with Pearl? Have you heard of it?
No, I think maybe I talked to Abadan about it at one point. Was Root one of the
No,
investors or no?
Root
Okay,
was not. No, Root was
okay.
not an
Maybe it was.
investor.
There's a different automation company that Root invested in. I think maybe maybe
Yeah.
Instrumental is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that would make sense. But so at Pearl, we built. It was a wireless solar powered backup camera. So we had a stereo camera pair, so you could do like obstacle detection and distance calculations, and then we used so it went around the license plate of a car, and then we used the user's smartphone as the display, and we were able to get like pretty crazy low latency video over Wi-Fi and
Right.
and even over Bluetooth to the phone. So, I mean, it was a crazy. It was a fun experience, like a really really fun experience. It was an awesome team. But when it comes to startups, it's and I very much see this now on the venture side of things. It's not just about how great of a team you can assemble, and it's not just about how amazing your product is and how well it works. Like so much of it is about timing and about catching like the right wave at the right time. Because I feel like when we started Pearl back in 2014, like you would see one article about self-driving cars come out every 2 or 3 months,
Right.
and then by the time we actually like launched our product, there was, I swear, there was like a new self-driving car startup being announced every single week.
That's right. Yeah.
It was crazy. But we had the ultimate vision of bringing autonomous features to existing cars, like the existing
Yeah.
car
So like
fleet.
retrofits.
Exactly,
Yeah.
like retrofits. But the world had changed, like from the time we started to the time that we shut down. I mean, the hype cycle around self-driving cars being like right around the corner, like that hype cycle was at its peak.
Right.
So
It's hard to like break out in a market where it's already flooded with the new fancy thing. It's like, hey, we built this thing, and then some new company's like, we're going to build this thing, and then that's almost as worth as much when it's the peak of a hype cycle, right?
Exactly. So I mean, we learned a tremendous amount in the process, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. But it was a great experience for me because I came from developing products at big companies, like big companies who had all the resources in the
Right.
world. And I knew that like to grow as an engineer, like I needed to learn what it meant to design products outside of that big company bubble, like what it meant to like operate in a world outside of Apple where you can't pick the supplier, any supplier you want, and you can't always have cutting edge technology. And it doesn't make sense to put a 1005s in every single design, right?
Yeah, right. Right.
Um,
So how does that? So some of the lessons you've learned then, like how has that rolled into your role now as at Root as a partner there?
Yeah, I mean, so it's fun for me at Root because like now I'm no longer sleeping in factories, which
That's
is which
good.
is kind
That's
of
good.
nice.
I
But
mean,
like I
maybe just
get
for
to
fun,
take
right? I mean, maybe it's just like a once in a
every
while
now and
thing,
then, every now and then, just for old time's sake. But like everything that I learned at Apple, everything I learned at Square, everything that I learned at Pearl, like you know, every single bug that I chased, every single test station that I debugged, like it sounds crazy, but like it actually helps inform and it helps guide our investment decisions.
Totally.
Because I feel like any company that comes in and pitches me and shows me a development schedule or like a tooling cost estimate, or a BOM roll up, like it's those companies need to be prepared to just dig in and explain like every assumption that they've made, because I've been there and I've lived it and I've done it again and again and again for big companies, medium-sized companies, small companies. So it's fun for me because it's become pattern matching.
Right.
Like
That
I
makes
can
sense.
use those things that I learned and, all the things that I did wrong, which there were many of them, but like all the things I did right and all the things I did wrong, to pattern match and then pick companies and then even take it one step further, which is like after we pick the companies, advising them and coaching all of the companies that we've invested in. And I feel like that's what really sets Root apart from most other VCs, is just that we are deeply, deeply technical VCs. And we love to back deeply technical founders, and we love to dig into the details in a way that most other VCs don't. Like we don't see ourselves as just like check writers.
Yeah. What is the usual interaction? I guess maybe for people that don't know, myself included, like what is the usual VC interaction? Would it be like, here's some money, see you later, we'll have a meeting in 3 months? Is that how it goes?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes there's a lot of VCs that write that will write a large number of checks. So it becomes impossible for them. I mean, it's a matter of like time and resources. Like it becomes impossible for them to spend considerable amount of time with every single portfolio company that they've ever invested in. And it compounds over time. Like the more companies you put money into, that are at different stages and need different amounts of support. So the thing for us is that like, we want to be real value add investors. So we don't write a huge number of checks. Like we invest in 6 to 8 companies every year.
Yep.
And by doing that, like it gives us the time and it gives us the ability to really roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty and to do whatever it takes, to help our founders succeed. Like we really are like above no task, below no task. Like we really have, we've done everything from like.
Do they let you on the line still? I mean, are you like camping out now? I'm just imagining you like knocking on the factory door, like, hey, I'm here to sleep.
So I have not slept on a factory line for any of our portfolio companies. But if they needed me to, I would be there. I'd be there with my pillow and my sleeping bag. So
that's great.
But I have reviewed contracts. I have helped them like review and negotiate contracts from contract manufacturers, and like my partners have dug in and been their first salesperson. It's closing deals, so it depends on what they need, but we really we take a lot of pride in making a smaller number of investments and then just really, really digging in and making sure that we're there when the founders need us and that we can do whatever it takes to help them through their journey, because it's not easy.
How what are some of the companies that maybe have been invested in since the last time that we talked to Abidon?
Yeah, so how long ago was it that you talked to him?
It was Christmas time, I remember, because I remember the Root logo had a bunch of like baubles on it, and we took a picture of Abidon in front of it.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah, it was good. It was. I'm not sure if you guys are at the same spot.
Yeah, well, so I'm guessing he probably talked about Particle. I would assume that a lot of your listeners have probably played around with Particle before.
Yep. So it's 2016 was the so like December of 2016 is the last time we talked to him. Got
it. So I don't know if he would have talked about Instrumental. Instrumental is an amazing company that is taking machine learning and bringing it to the manufacturing line.
Yeah.
So when people think of manufacturing, they think of like automated lines. They think of things that are like Tesla style,
Right, big like robots.
The big robots, clean factories, like highly, highly automated. And the reality of the situation is that is not at all how like 99.9% of factories operate today. Like there are still humans performing really, really manual tasks. And then the scarier part, like the part that's even scarier to me, is that there are humans doing visual inspection to confirm that the humans that were doing the manual tasks actually did them correctly. It's insane to me that with the technology that exists today, that people are still on the lines, and people are still inspecting products to make sure that they were assembled.
I remember a story about a friend who was on a line in a we'll just say a different country, and they were literally using an old tree stump as like a fixture. It was a very extreme example, but it was a tree stump. It was like, okay.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. I've used some pretty creative things for fixtures before, but never a tree stump.
Yeah.
But I mean, the amazing thing about Instrumental is that like they will deploy stations on your manufacturing line, and their stations will capture images of every single product that you build, and then automatically flag anomalies.
Yeah, that's great.
So like if a screw is missing, it'll flag it. Like if there's excess glue around a certain component, like they'll flag it. And like one of the examples, we actually used as Instrumental when I was at Pearl to find like weird bubbles in our solar panel lamination stack. And it would capture and flag all of these like crazy bubbles that we saw. And it doesn't require like extensive rules-based training. It's like you feed it in a bunch of images, and even if a brand new failure mode pops up that you've never seen before, like it will still pick it out of the bunch and highlight it so that an engineer can come over and review it.
Yeah. That's great. And that saves a ton of time, and it probably catches weird things. I mean, like humans are very good at pattern matching, like you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But it's there's what happens when they're tired, what happens when there's, you never know, or it's just, you're not even inspecting. You can inspect the whole line now instead of having to do like spot checking, like a lot of lines switch to.
Yeah, and the problem is that humans are looking for things. Visual inspection operators on the line are looking for things that they've been trained to look for.
Sure.
Like they're given a poster board of pictures of things that they've seen before, and that's exactly what they're looking for, and they will look for exactly that and nothing else. So anytime you get a new failure mode pop up, it can very, very easily slip through visual inspection. And I've seen that happen like many times over and over again. And the scary thing is like when assembly failures get missed, like it can be catastrophic. Like anybody who's ever had to deal with like recalls on batteries understands like exactly how important.
Oh yeah.
Exactly how important that is.
Yeah, we've had actually one of my old roommates. He was working as a consultant and had to deal with the Samsung thing. So,
gosh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
It was a great show. If people haven't listened to that one, it's Steve Cruiser, and he works for I forget the name of the company, but one of the big consulting firms that does like expert witness stuff, and it's great look at how you might go about inspecting a big failure like that. So,
yeah, that's awesome.
Well, what about other? I mean, so what other companies? I guess. You said there's an investment thesis of like hardware in general, but are there things that you're personally interested in the hardware space right now?
Yeah, so this definitely plays into my background for sure, but I am super excited and have been talking to a lot of companies that are building tools for manufacturing. Okay. So I feel like there's a huge portion of the manufacturing base that is just like not accessible at all to people. It's like right now, like how do you find a supplier if you need like a certain part? Like you're probably asking around and talking to people that you know, and it's so supplier discovery is a really huge problem. And then I also feel like as more and more factories trend towards automation, like they're not set up right now in a way that that automation could be like dropped in tomorrow. There's the whole like premise and promise of like industry 4.0.
Yeah. Everybody loves those terms. Yeah.
Like whatever that means, buzzword.
But I think like the dark factories is always the one that like, that's like the ultimate goal of like, oh, you just turn off the lights and just pops out the widgets at the end. It's like, no, that is very, very limited. Even, like there's always people in there still. And it's like, I understand we're moving towards that method, but there needs to be a lot of tools like you're talking about to get there.
Yeah, and that's so far out. It's so far out from making sense for the vast majority of products. And even if it did make sense for the vast majority of products, the problem is that the factory infrastructure, and I mean I'm talking about like the basic shop floor systems that they're using, and the MES, like the manufacturing execution system, like the fundamental building blocks are frankly like still in the Stone Age for most
Right.
factories, and are not at a place where are just not in a place where like automation could be dropped in.
So how do people reach out if they are interested? I mean, like, especially that, I'm really curious about that whole like when people you're investing in people, that whole thing. Like, if someone raised their hand, they're like, yeah, I'm thinking about this thing. Like, how does that conversation get started with Root?
Yeah, so it's sorry, the wood
We did
is
it.
winding
The part has just been popped out. Now it goes into the instrumental, and it's going to be inspected.
I think I called him off. No, so I mean, we try to make ourselves as accessible as we possibly can for anyone who's thinking about starting up a company, especially if it's in the hardware, robotics, manufacturing, automation space. So it's I definitely encourage people to don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to me via our website. I'm less active on Twitter, but you can find me there too. And I don't want people to hold back and hesitate because they don't feel like they have a polished pitch deck, or because they don't have a fully baked idea. Like, we want to be here for people to help brainstorm. Like, we want to be a sounding board early in the process. Rather than like the VC that you come to when everything is, your idea is fully baked and your business model is worked out in detail.
Yeah, it seems like it's for friends who have done fundraising, they're like, yeah, I got one shot. I have to try and reach this person. It sounds like because you and your team at Root, it's much more like conversational, and it's like, hey, let's actually talk about this thing. But so I'm just to belabor the point a little bit, like what does that interaction actually look like though? So like, okay, so I say I'm interested in making a smart dog food thingy or bobber, right? Like what happens next though?
So a lot of times we'll have people come in and we'll sit around a table and we'll brainstorm. Like, we'll talk about like, what's the market? Who would want to buy this? What products exist out there? How do they work? What technologies do they use? Like, what technologies have you looked at that you think, can be a key differentiator? Like, how are you going to make this so much better that people are willing to pay for it? And then what's your technical moat?
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to prevent, a copycat from coming in 6 months later and just doing exactly what you did? So, and then we'll also work with people on like the long-term vision. Like, you're building a dog food widget today, but what's next and what's after that?
What happens when dogs start eating, futuristic food pills instead of food,
And the thing about us is, like, even as hardware investors, it's pretty rare. Actually, I don't think trying to think if we ever have invested in hardware for margin. Like, typically it's really hard to build a venture scale business if you're selling a hardware product and taking a percentage,
and it stops there, right?
And that's it. Yep. And that's it. Yeah. So we're looking for platforms. We're looking for hardware that like unlocks a platform or an ecosystem like Particle, or has like some form of recurring revenue that, we can tap into in the future.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Awesome. Well, people should definitely check out, it's root.vc, right? That's the website.
Yep. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Chrissy Meyer, CHRISSY.
Great. All right. Well, Chrissy, thanks so much for telling us about your experience and all this stuff with Root. I'm looking forward to seeing all the companies you're going to be investing in the future.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much, Chris.